Some Account of the Life of Mr. William Shakespeare,
1709.
by Nicholas Rowe, read by Vincent Bagnall. It seems to be a kind of respect due to the memory of excellent men, especially of those whom their wit and learning have made famous, to deliver some account of themselves as well as their works to posterity. For this reason, how fond do we see some people of discovering any little personal story of the great men of antiquity, their families, and the common accidents of their lives, and even their shape, make, and features, have been the subject of critical inquiries. How trifling soever this curiosity may seem to be, it is certainly very natural, and we are hardly satisfied with an account of any remarkable person till we have heard him described even to the very clothes he wears. As for what relates to men of letters, the knowledge of an author may sometimes conduce to the better understanding his book, and though the works of Mr. Shakespeare may seem to many not to want a comment, yet I fancy some little account of the man himself may not be thought improper to go along with them. He was the son of Mr. John Shakespeare, and was born at Stratford-upon-Avon in Warwickshire in April 1564. His family, as appears by the register and public writings relating to that town, were of good figure and fashion there, and are mentioned as gentlemen. His father, who was a considerable dealer in wool, had so large a family, 10 children in all, that though he was his eldest son, he could give him no better education than his own employment. He had bred him, 'tis true, for some time at a free school, where 'tis probable he acquired that little Latin he was master of, but the narrowness of his circumstances, and the want of his assistance at home, forced his father to withdraw him from thence, and unhappily prevented his further proficiency in that language. It is without controversy that he had no knowledge of the writings of the antient poets, not only from this reason, but from his works themselves, where we find no traces of anything that looks like an imitation of him. The delicacy of his taste and the natural bent of his own great genius, equal, if not superior to some of the best of theirs, would certainly have led him to read and study him with so much pleasure, that some of their fine images would naturally have insinuated themselves into and been mixed with his own writings, so that his not copying at least something from them may be an argument of his never having read them. Whether his ignorance of the antients were a disadvantage to him, or no, may admit of a dispute, for though the knowledge of them might have made him more correct, yet it is not improbable but that the regularity and deference for them, which would have attended that correctness, might have restrained some of that fire, impetuosity, and even beautiful extravagance which we admire in Shakespeare. And I believe we are better pleased with those thoughts, altogether new and uncommon, which his own imagination supplied him so abundantly with, than if he had given us the most beautiful passages out of the Greek and Latin poets, and that in the most agreeable manner that it was possible for a master of the English language to deliver them. Some Latin, without question, he did know, and one may see up and down in his plays how far his reading that way went. In Love's Labour's Lost, the pedant comes out with a verse of Mantuan, and in Titus Andronicus, one of the Gothic princes, upon reading Integer vitae sceleris purus non ege mari jaculis nec arcu, says 'tis a verse in Horace, but he remembers it out of his grammar, which I suppose was the author's case. Whatever Latin he had, 'tis certain he understood French, as may be observed from many words and sentences scattered up and down his plays in that language, and especially from one scene in Henry V, written wholly in it. Upon his leaving school, he seems to have given entirely into that way of living which his father proposed to him, and in order to settle in the world after a family manner, he thought fit to marry while he was yet very young. His wife was the daughter of one Hathaway, said to have been a substantial yeoman in the neighborhood of Stratford. In this kind of settlement he continued for some time, till an extravagance that he was guilty of forced him both out of his country and that way of living which he had taken up. And though it seemed at first to be a blemish upon his good manners, and a misfortune to him, yet it afterwards happily proved the occasion of exerting one of the greatest geniuses that ever was known in dramatic poetry. He had, by a misfortune common enough to young fellows, fallen into ill company, and amongst them some that made a frequent practice of deer-stealing, engaged him with them more than once in robbing a park that belonged to Sir Thomas Lucy of Charlecot, near Stratford. For this he was prosecuted by that gentleman, as he thought somewhat too severely, and in order to revenge that ill usage, he made a ballad upon him. And though this probably the first essay of his poetry be lost, yet it is said to have been so very bitter that it redoubled the prosecution against him to that degree that he was obliged to leave his business and family in Warwickshire for some time and shelter himself in London. It is at this time and upon this accident that he is said to have made his first acquaintance in the playhouse. He was received into the company, then in being at first, in a very mean rank, but his admirable wit and the natural turn of it to the stage soon distinguished him, if not as an extraordinary actor, yet as an excellent writer. His name is printed, as the custom was in those times, amongst those of the other players before some old plays, but without any particular account of what sort of parts he used to play. And though I have inquired, I could never meet with any further account of him this way than that the top of his performance was the Ghost in his own Hamlet. I should have been much more pleased to have learned from some certain authority, which was the first play he wrote. It would be without doubt a pleasure to any man curious in things of this kind to see and know what was the first essay of a fancy like Shakespeare's. Perhaps we are not to look for his beginnings, like those of other authors, among their least perfect writings. Art had so little and nature so large a share in what he did that, for aught I know, the performances of his youth, as they were the most vigorous and had the most fire and strength of imagination in them, were the best. I would not be thought by this to mean that his fancy was so loose and extravagant as to be independent on the rule and government of judgment, but that what he thought was commonly so great, so justly and rightly conceived in itself, that it wanted little or no correction, and was immediately approved by an impartial judgment at the first sight. Mr. Dryden seems to think that Pericles is one of his first plays, but there is no judgment to be formed on that, since there is good reason to believe that the greatest part of that play was not written by him. Though it is owned, some part of it certainly was, particularly the last act. But though the order of time in which the several pieces were written be generally uncertain, yet there are passages in some few of them which seem to fix their dates. So the chorus in the beginning of the fifth act of Henry V, by a compliment very handsomely turned to the Earl of Essex, shews the play to have been written when that lord was general for the Queen in Ireland, and his elegy upon Queen Elizabeth and her successor King James in the latter end of his Henry VII is a proof of that play's being written after the accession of the latter, of those two princes to the crown of England. Now, whatever the particular times of his writing were, the people of his age, who began to grow wonderfully fond of diversions of this kind, could not be but highly pleased to see a genius arise amongst them so pleasurable, so rich a vein, and so plentifully capable of furnishing their favorite entertainments. Besides the advantages of his wit, he was in himself a good-natured man, of great sweetness in his manners, and a most agreeable companion, so that it is no wonder if with so many good qualities he made himself acquainted with the best conversations of those times. Queen Elizabeth had several of his plays acted before her, and without doubt gave him many gracious marks of her favor. It is that maiden princess plainly whom he intends by a fair vestal throned by the west. Midsummer Night's Dream. And that whole passage is a compliment very properly brought in and very handsomely applied to her. She was so well pleased with that admirable character of Falstaff in the two parts of Henry IV, that she commanded him to continue it for one play more, and to shew him in love. And this is said to be the occasion of his writing The Merry Wives of Windsor. How well she was obeyed! The play itself is an admirable proof. Upon this occasion it may not be improper to observe that this part of Falstaff is said to have been written originally under the name of Oldcastle. Some of that family being then remaining, the Queen was pleased to command him to alter it, upon which he made use of Falstaff. The present offense was indeed avoided, but I don't know whether the author may not have been somewhat to blame in his second choice, since it is certain that Sir John Falstaff who was a Knight of the Garter and a Lieutenant General, was a name of distinguished merit in the wars in France, in Henry V's and Henry VI's times. What grace soe'er the Queen conferred upon him, it was not to her only he owed the fortune which the reputation of his wit made. He had the honour to meet with many great and uncommon marks of favour and friendship from the Earl of Southampton, famous in the histories of that time for his friendship to the unfortunate Earl of Essex. It was to that noble lord that he dedicated his Venus and Adonis, the only piece of his poetry which he ever published himself, though many of his plays were surreptitiously and lamely printed in his lifetime. There is one instance so singular in the magnificence of this patron of Shakespeare's that if I had not been assured that the story was handed down by Sir William de Avenant, who was probably very well acquainted with his affairs, I should not have ventured to have inserted that my Lord Southampton, at one time, gave him £1,000 to enable him to go through with a purchase which he heard he had a mind to. A bounty very great and very rare at any time, and almost equal to that profuse generosity the present age has shewn to French dancers and Italian eunuchs. What particular habitude or friendships he contracted with private men, I have not been able to learn, more than that every one who had a true taste of merit and could distinguish men, had generally a just value and esteem for him. His exceeding candour and good nature must certainly have inclined all the gentler part of the world to love him, as the power of his wit obliged the men of the most delicate knowledge and polite learning to admire him. Amongst these was the incomparable Mr. Edmund Spenser, who speaks of him in his Tears of the Muses, not only with the praises due to a good poet, but even lamenting his absence with the tenderness of a friend. The passage is in Thalia's complaint for the decay of dramatic poetry, and the contempt the stage then lay under amongst his miscellaneous works on page 147. And he, the man, whom nature's self had made to mock herself and truth, to imitate with kindly counter under mimic shade, our pleasant Willie, is dead of late, with whom all joy and jolly merriment is also deaded, and in dolor drent. Instead thereof, scoffing scurrility and scorning folly with contempt is crept, rolling in rhymes of shameless ribaldry, without regard or due decorum kept. Each idle wit at will presumes to make, and doth the learned task upon him take. But that same gentle spirit from whose pen large streams of honey and sweet nectar flow, scorning the boldness such base-born men, which dare their follies forth so rashly throw, doth rather choose to sit in idle cell, than so himself to mockery to sell. I know some people have been of opinion that Shakespeare is not meant by Willie in the first stanza of these verses, because Spenser's death happened 20 years before Shakespeare's. But besides that the character is not applicable to any man of that time but himself, it is plain by the last stanza that Mr. Spenser does not mean that he was then really dead, but only that he had withdrawn himself from the public, or at least withheld his hand from writing, out of a disgust he had taken at the then ill taste of the town and the mean condition of the stage. Mr. Dryden was always of opinion these verses were meant of Shakespeare, and 'tis highly probable they were so, since he was 33 years old at Spenser's death, and his reputation in poetry must have been great enough before that time to have deserved what is here said of him. His acquaintance with Ben Jonson began with a remarkable piece of humanity and good nature. Mr. Jonson, who was at that time altogether unknown to the world, had offered one of his plays to the players in order to have it acted, and the persons into whose hands it was put, after having turned it carelessly and superciliously over, were just upon returning it to him with an ill-natured answer that it would be of no service to their company, when Shakespeare luckily cast his eye upon it, and found something so well in it as to engage him first to read it through, and afterwards to recommend Mr. Jonson and his writings to the public. After this they were professed friends, though I don't know whether the other ever made him an equal return of gentleness and sincerity. Ben was naturally proud and insolent, and in the days of his reputation did so far take upon him the supremacy in wit that he could not but look with an evil eye upon any one that seemed to stand in competition with him. And if at times he has affected to commend him, it has always been with some reserve, insinuating his uncorrectness, a careless manner of writing, and want of judgment, the praise of seldom altering or blotting out what he writ, which was given him by the players who were the first publishers of his works after his death, was what Johnson could not bear. He thought it impossible, perhaps, for another man to strike out the greatest thoughts in the finest expression, and to reach those excellencies of poetry with the ease of a first imagination, which himself, with infinite labor and study, could but hardly attain to. Johnson was certainly a very good scholar, and in that had the advantage of Shakespeare, though at the same time I believe it must be allowed that what nature gave the latter was more than a balance for what books had given the former. And the judgment of a great man upon this occasion was, I think, very just and proper. In a conversation between Sir John Suckling, Sir William de Avenant, Endymion Porter, Mr. Hales of Eton, and Ben Jonson, Sir John Suckling, who was a professed admirer of Shakespeare, had undertaken his defence against Ben Jonson with some warmth. Mr. Hales, who had sat still for some time, hearing Ben frequently reproaching him with the want of learning and ignorance of the Antients, told him at last that if Mr. Shakespeare had not read the Antients, he had likewise not stolen anything from him, a fault the other made no confidence of, and that if he would produce any one topic finely treated by any of them, he would undertake to shew something upon the same subject at least as well written by Shakespeare. Johnson did indeed take a large liberty, even to the transcribing and translating of whole scenes together, and sometimes, with all deference to so great a name as his, not altogether for the advantage of the authors of whom he borrowed. And if Augustus and Virgil were really what he has made them in a scene of his Poetaster, they are as odd an emperor and a poet as ever met. Shakespeare, on the other hand, was beholding to nobody farther than the foundation of the tale. The incidents were often his own, and the writing entirely so. There is one play of his, indeed, The Comedy of Errors, in a great measure taken from the Menechmi of Plautus. How that happened I cannot easily divine, since, as I hinted before, I do not take him to have been master of Latin enough to read it in the original, and I know of no translation of Plautus so old as his time. As I have not proposed to myself to enter into a large and complete criticism upon Mr. Shakespeare's works, so I suppose it will neither be expected that I should take notice of the severe remarks that have been formerly made upon him by Mr. Rymer. I must confess I can't very well see what could be the reason of his animadverting with so much sharpness upon the faults of a man excellent on most occasions, and whom all the world ever was and will be inclined to have an esteem and veneration for. If it was to shew his own knowledge in the art of poetry, besides that there is a vanity in making that only his design, I question if there be not many imperfections as well in those schemes and precepts he has given for the direction of others, as well as in that sample of tragedy which he has written to shew the excellency of his own genius. If he had a pique against the man, and wrote on purpose to ruin a reputation so well established, he has had the mortification to fail altogether in his attempt, and to see the world at least as fond of Shakespeare as of his critique. But I won't believe a gentleman and a good-natured man capable of the last intention. Whatever may have been his meaning, finding fault is certainly the easiest task of knowledge, and commonly those men of good judgment, who are likewise of good and gentle dispositions, abandon this ungrateful province to the tyranny of pedants. If one would enter into the beauties of Shakespeare, there is a much larger as well as a more delightful field, but as I won't prescribe to the tastes of other people, so I will only take the liberty, with all due submission to the judgment of others, to observe some of those things I have been pleased with in looking him over. His plays are properly to be distinguished only into comedies and tragedies. Those which are called histories, and even some of his comedies, are really tragedies, with a run or mixture of a comedy amongst them. That way of tragic comedy was the common mistake of that age, and is indeed become so agreeable to the English taste that though the severer critiques among us cannot bear it, yet the generality of our audiences seem to be better pleased with it than with an exact tragedy. The Merry Wives of Windsor, The Comedy of Errors, The Taming of the Shrew are all pure comedy. The rest, however, they are called, have something of both kinds. 'Tis not very easy to determine which way of writing he was most excellent, and there is certainly a great deal of entertainment in his comical humours, and though they did not then strike at all ranks of people, as the satire of the present age has taken the liberty to do, yet there is a pleasing and a well-distinguished variety in those characters which he thought fit to meddle with. Falstaff is allowed by everybody to be a masterpiece. The character is always well sustained, though drawn out into the length of 3 plays, and even the account of his death, given by his old landlady, Mrs. Quickly, in the first act of Henry V, though it be extremely natural, is yet as diverting as any part of his life. If there be any fault in the draught he has made of this lewd old fellow, it is that though he has made him a thief, lying, cowardly, vainglorious, and in short every way vicious, yet he has given him so much wit as to make him almost too agreeable, and I don't know whether some people have not, in remembrance of the diversion he had formerly afforded him, been sorry to see his friend Hal use him so scurvily when he comes to the crown in the end of the second part of Henry IV. Amongst other extravagances in The Merry Wives of Windsor, he has made him a dear stealer, that he might at the same time remember his Warwickshire prosecutor. Under the name of Justice Shallow, he has given him very near the same coat of arms which Dugdale, in his Antiquities of that county, describes for a family there, and makes the Welsh parson descant very pleasantly upon him. That whole play is admirable. The humours are various and well opposed. The main design, which is to cure Ford his unreasonable jealousy, is extremely well conducted. Falstaff's billet doux and Master Slender's "Ah, sweet Anne Page" are very good expressions of love in their way. In Twelfth Night there is something singularly ridiculous and pleasant in the fantastical Steward Malvolio. The parasite in the Vainglorious and Parolles, in All's Well That Ends Well, is as good as anything of that kind in Plautus or Terence. Petruchio in The Taming of the Shrew is an uncommon piece of humour. The conversation of Benedick and Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing, and of Rosalind in As You Like It, have much wit and sprightliness all along. His clowns, without which character there was hardly any play written that time, are all very entertaining, and I believe Thersites and Troilus and Cressida, and Epaminondas and Timon will be allowed to be masterpieces of ill nature and satirical snarling. To these I might add that incomparable character of Shylock the Jew in The Merchant of Venice. But though we have seen that play received and acted as a comedy, and the part of the Jew performed by an excellent comedian, yet I cannot but think it was designed tragically by the author. There appears in it such a deadly spirit of revenge, such a savage fierceness and fellness, and such a bloody designation of cruelty and mischief, as cannot agree either with the style or characters of comedy. The play itself, take it all together, seems to me to be one of the most finished of any of Shakespeare's. The tale, indeed, in that part relating to the caskets and the extravagant and unusual kind of bond given by Antonio, is a little too much removed from the rules of probability, but taking the fact for granted, we must allow it to be very beautifully written. There is something in the friendship of Antonio to Bassanio, very great, generous, and tender. The whole fourth act, supposing, as I said, the fact to be probable, is extremely fine, but there are 2 passages that deserve a particular notice. The first is what Portia says in praise of mercy, and the other on the power of music. The melancholy of Jaques, in As You Like It, is as singular and odd as it is diverting. And if what Horace says, difficile est propri communia dicere, 'twill be a hard task for anyone to go beyond him in the description of the several degrees and ages of man's life, though the thought be old and common enough. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man, in his time, plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. At first the infant mewling and puking in the nurse's arms, and then the whining schoolboy with his satchel and shining morning face creeping like snail unwillingly to school. And then the lover, sighing like furnace, with a woeful ballad made to his mistress' eyebrow. Then a soldier, full of strange oaths and bearded like the pard, jealous in honour, sudden and quick in quarrel, seeking the bubble reputation even in the cannon's mouth. And then the justice, in fair round belly, with good cape and lined, with eyes severe and beard of formal cut, full of wise saws and modern instances, and so he plays his part. The sixth age shifts into the lean and slippered pantaloon, with spectacles on nose and pouch on side, his youthful hose well saved, a world too wide for his shrunk shank and his big manly voice, turning again toward childish treble pipes and whistles in his sound. Last scene of all that ends this strange, eventful history is second childishness in mere oblivion, sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. His images are indeed everywhere, so lively, that the thing he would represent stands full before you, and you possess every part of it. I will venture to point out one more, which is, I think, as strong and as uncommon as anything I ever saw. 'Tis an image of patience. Speaking of a maid in love, he says, "She never told her love, but let concealment, like a worm in the bud, feed on her damask cheek. She pined in thought, and sate like patience on a monument, smiling at grief." What an image is here given, and what a task would it have been for the greatest masters of Greece and Rome to have expressed the passions designed by this sketch of statuary? The style of his comedy is, in general, natural to the characters, and easy in itself, in the wit most commonly sprightly and pleasing, except in those places where he runs into doggerel rhymes, as in the Comedy of Errors, and a passage or two in some other plays. As for his jingling sometimes and playing upon words, it was the common vice of the age he lived in, and if we find it in the pulpit, made use of as an ornament to the sermons of some of the gravest divines of those times, perhaps it may not be thought too light for the stage. But certainly the greatness of this author's genius does nowhere so much appear as where he gives his imagination an entire loose, and raises his fancy to a flight above mankind and the limits of the visible world. Such are his attempts in The Tempest, Midsummer Night's Dream, Macbeth, and Hamlet. Of these, The Tempest, however it comes to be placed the first by the former publishers of his works, can never have been the first written by him. It seems to me as perfect in its kind as almost anything we have of his. One may observe that the unities are kept here with an exactness uncommon to the liberties of his writing, though that was what I suppose he valued himself least upon, since his excellencies were all of another kind. I am very sensible that he does in this play depart too much from that likeness to truth which ought to be observed in these sort of writings. Yet he does it so very finely that one is easily drawn in to have more faith for his sake than reason does well allow of. His magic has something in it very solemn and very poetical, and that extravagant character of Caliban is mighty well sustained, shews a wonderful invention in the author, who could strike out such a particular wild image, and is certainly one of the finest and most uncommon grotesques that was ever seen. The observation which I have been informed 3 very great men concurred in making upon this part was extremely just, that Shakespeare had not only found a new character in his Caliban, but had also devised and adapted a new manner of language for that character. Among the particular beauties of this piece, I think one may be allowed to point out the tale of Prospero in the first act, his speech to Ferdinand in the fourth, upon the breaking up of the Mask of Juno and Ceres, and that in the fifth, where he dissolves his charms and resolves to break his magic rod. This play has been altered by Sir William de Avenant and Mr. Dryden, and though I won't arraign the judgment of those 2 great men, yet I think I may be allowed to say that there are some things left out by them that might and even ought to have been kept in. Mr. Dryden was an admirer of our author, and indeed he owed him a great deal, as those who have read them both may very easily observe, And I think in justice to 'em both, I should not on this occasion omit what Mr. Dryden has said of him. Shakespeare, who taught by none, did first impart to Fletcher wit, to labouring Johnson art. He, monarch-like, gave those his subjects law, and is that nature which they paint and draw. Fletcher reached that which on his heights did grow, whilst Johnson crept and gathered all below. This did his love, and this his mirth digest. One imitates him most, the other best. If they have since outwrit all other men, 'tis with the drops which fell from Shakespeare's pen. The storm which vanished on the neighbouring shore was taught by Shakespeare's tempest to roar. That innocence and beauty which did smile in Fletcher grew on this enchanted isle. But Shakespeare's magic could not copied be. Within that circle none durst walk but he. I must confess 'twas bold, nor would you now that liberty to vulgar wits allow, which works by magic supernatural things, but Shakespeare's power is sacred as a king's. Prologue to The Tempest, as it is altered by Mr. Dryden. It is the same magic that raises the fairies in Midsummer Night's Dream, the witches in Macbeth, and the ghost in Hamlet, with thoughts and language so proper to the parts they sustain, and so peculiar to the talent of this writer. But of the two last of these plays, I shall have occasion to take notice. Among the tragedies of Mr. Shakespeare, if one undertook to examine the greatest part of these by those rules which are established by Aristotle, and taken from the model of the Grecian stage, it would be no very hard task to find a great many faults. But as Shakespeare lived under a kind of mere light of nature, and had never been made acquainted with the regularity of those written precepts, so it would be hard to judge him by a law he knew nothing of. We are to consider him as a man that lived in a state of almost universal license and ignorance. There was no established judge, but everyone took the liberty to write according to the dictates of his own fancy. When one considers that there is not one play before him of a reputation good enough to entitle it to an appearance on the present stage, it cannot but be a matter of great wonder that he should advance dramatic poetry so far as he did. The fable is what is generally placed the first among those that are reckoned the constituent parts of a tragic or heroic poem, not perhaps as it is the most difficult or beautiful, but as it is the first properly to be thought of in the contrivance and course of the whole. And with the fable ought to be considered the fit disposition, order, and conduct of its several parts, as it is not in this province of the drama that the strength and mastery of Shakespeare lay, so I shall not undertake the tedious and ill-natured trouble to point out the several faults he was guilty of in it. His tales were seldom invented, but rather taken either from true history or novels and romances, and he commonly made use of them in that order, with those incidents, and that extent of time in which he found them in the authors from whence he borrowed them. So The Winter's Tale, which is taken from an old book called The Delectable History of Dorastus and Faunia, contains the space of 16 or 17 years, and the scene is sometimes laid in Bohemia and sometimes in Sicily, according to the original order of the story. Almost all his historical plays comprehend a great length of time in very different and distinct places. And in his Antony and Cleopatra, the scene travels over the greatest part of the Roman Empire. But in recompense for his carelessness in this point, when he comes to another part of the drama, the manners of his characters in acting or speaking, what is proper for them and fit to be shown by the poet, he may be generally justified, and in very many places greatly commended. For those plays which he has taken from the English or Roman history, let any man compare him, and he will not find the character as exact in the poet as the historian. He seems so far from proposing to himself any one action for a subject, that the title very often tells you 'tis the life of King John, King Richard, etc. What can be more agreeable to the idea our historians give of Henry VI than the picture Shakespeare has drawn of him? His manners are everywhere exactly the same with the story. One finds him still described with simplicity, passive sanctity, want of courage, weakness of mind, and easy submission to the governance of an imperious wife or prevailing faction. though at the same time the poet does justice to his good qualities and moves the pity of his audience for him by showing him pious, disinterested, a contemner of the things of this world, and wholly resigned to the severest dispensations of God's providence. There's a short scene in the second part of Henry VI, Volume 3, which I cannot but think admirable in its kind. Cardinal Beaufort, who had murdered the Duke of Gloucester, is shewn in the last agonies on his deathbed, with the good king praying over him. There is so much terror in one, so much tenderness and moving piety in the other, as must touch anyone who is capable either of fear or pity. In his Henry VIII, that prince is drawn with that greatness of mind and all those good qualities which are attributed to him in any account of his reign. If his faults are not shewn in an equal degree, and the shades in this picture do not bear a just proportion to the lights, it is not that the artist wanted either colors or skill in the disposition of them, but the truth, I believe, might be that he forebore doing it out of regard to Queen Elizabeth, since it could have been no very great respect to the memory of his mistress, to have exposed some certain parts of her father's life upon the stage. He has dealt much more freely with the minister of that great king, and certainly nothing was ever more justly written than the character of Cardinal Wolsey. He has shown him tyrannical, cruel, and insolent in his prosperity, and yet by a wonderful address he makes his fall and ruin the subject of general compassion. The whole man, with his vices and virtues, is finely and exactly described in the second scene of the fourth act. The distresses likewise of Queen Catherine in this play are very movingly touched, and though the art of the poet has screened King Henry from any gross imputation of injustice, yet one is inclined to wish the Queen had met with a fortune more worthy of her birth and virtue. Nor are the manners proper to the persons represented less justly observed in those characters taken from the Roman history, and of this the fierceness and impatience of Coriolanus, his courage and disdain of the common people, the virtue and philosophical temper of Brutus, and the irregular greatness of mind in Mark Antony, are beautiful proofs. For the two last especially, you find them exactly as they are described by Plutarch, from whom certainly Shakespeare copied them. He has indeed followed his original pretty close, and taken in several little incidents that might have been spared in a play. But as I hinted before, his design seems most commonly rather to describe those great men in the several fortunes and accidents of their lives, than to take any single great action and form his work simply upon that. However, there are some of his pieces where the fable is founded upon one action only. Such are more especially Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, and Othello. The design in Romeo and Juliet is plainly the punishment of their two families, for the unreasonable feuds and animosities that had been so long kept up between them, and occasioned the effusion of so much blood. In the management of this story, he has shown something wonderfully tender and passionate in the love part, and very pitiful in the distress. Hamlet is founded on much the same tale with the Electra of Sophocles. In each of them, a young prince is engaged to revenge the death of his father. Their mothers are equally guilty, are both concerned in the murder of their husbands, and are afterwards married to the murderers. There is in the first part of the Greek tragedy something very moving in the grief of Electra, but as Mr. Dacier has observed, there is something very unnatural and shocking in the manners he has given that Princess and Orestes in the latter part. Orestes imbrues his hands in the blood of his own mother, and that barbarous action is performed, though not immediately upon the stage, yet so near, that the audience hear Clytemnestra crying out to Aegisthus for help, and to her son for mercy, while Electra and her daughter and a princess, both of them characters that ought to have appeared with more decency, stands upon the stage and encourages her brother in the parricide. What horror does this not raise? Clytemnestra was a wicked woman, and had deserved to die. Nay, in the truth of the story, she was killed by her own son. But to represent an action of this kind on the stage is certainly an offense against those rules of manners proper to the persons that ought to be observed there. On the contrary, let us only look a little on the conduct of Shakespeare. Hamlet is represented with the same piety towards his father and resolution to revenge his death as Orestes. He has the same abhorrence for his mother's guilt, which to provoke him the more is heightened by incest, but 'tis with wonderful art and justness of judgment that the poet restrains him from doing violence to his mother. To prevent anything of that kind, he makes his father's ghost forbid that part of his vengeance. But howsoever thou pursue this act, taint not thy mind, nor let thy soul contrive against thy mother aught leave her to heaven, and to those thorns that in her bosom lodge, to prick and sting her. This is to distinguish rightly between horror and terror. The latter is a proper passion of tragedy, but the former ought always to be carefully avoided, and certainly no dramatic writer ever succeeded better in raising terror in the minds of an audience than Shakespeare has done. The whole tragedy of Macbeth, but more especially the scene where the king is murdered, a man who, though he had no other good qualities, as he has a great many, must have made his way into the esteem of all men of letters by this only excellency. No man is better acquainted with Shakespeare's manner of expression, and indeed he has studied him so well, and is so much a master of him, that whatever part of his he performs, he does it as if it had been written on purpose for him, and that the author had exactly conceived it as he plays it. I must own a particular obligation to him for the most considerable part of the passages relating to his life, which I have here transmitted to the public. His veneration for the memory of Shakespeare, having engaged him to make a journey into Warwickshire, on purpose to gather up what remains he could of a name for which he had so great a value. Since I had at first resolved not to enter into any critical controversy, I won't pretend to inquire into the justness of Mr. Rymer's remarks on Othello. He has certainly pointed out some faults very judiciously, and indeed they are such as most people will agree with him to be faults, but I wish he would likewise have observed some of the beauties too, as I think it became an exact and equal critique to do. It seems strange that he should allow nothing good in the whole. If the fable and incidents are not to his taste, yet the thoughts are almost everywhere very noble, and the diction manly and proper. These last indeed are parts of Shakespeare's praise, which it would be very hard to dispute with him. His sentiments and images of things are great and natural, and his expression, though perhaps in some instances a little irregular, just and raised in proportion to his subject and occasion. It would be endless to mention the particular instances that might be given of this kind. But his book is in the possession of the public, and 'twill be hard to dip into any part of it without finding what I have said of him made good. The latter part of his life was spent, as all men of good sense will wish theirs may be, in ease, retirement, and the conversation of his friends. He had the good fortune to gather an estate equal to his occasion, and in that to his wish, and is said to have spent some years before his death at his native Stratford. His pleasurable wit and good nature engaged him in the acquaintance and entitled him to the friendship of the gentlemen of the neighborhood. Amongst them it is a story almost still remembered in that country, that he had a particular intimacy with Mr. Combe, an old gentleman noted thereabouts for his wealth and usury. It happened that in a pleasant conversation amongst their common friends, Mr. Combe told Shakespeare, in a laughing manner, that he fancied he intended to write his epitaph, if he happened to outlive him, and since he could not know what might be said of him when he was dead, he desired it might be done immediately, upon which Shakespeare gave him these 4 verses. 10 in the 100 lies here engraved, 'tis 100 to 10 his soul is not saved. If any man ask who ties in this tomb, oh ho, quoth the devil, 'tis my John a Combe. But the sharpness of the satire is said to have stung the man so severely that he never forgave it. He died in the 53rd year of his age, and was buried on the north side of the chancel in the great church at Stratford, where a monument, as engraved in the plate, is placed in the wall. On his gravestone underneath is, "Good friend, for Jesus' sake, forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." He had 3 daughters, of which 2 lived to be married, Judith, the elder, to one Mr. Thomas Quiney, by whom she had 3 sons, who all died without children, and Susanna, who was his favorite, to Dr. John Hall, a physician of good reputation in that country. She left 1 child only, a daughter who was married first to Thomas Nash, Esquire, and afterwards to Sir John Bernard of Abington, but died likewise without issue. This is what I could learn of any note, either relating to himself or family. The character of the man is best seen in his writings, but since Ben Jonson has made a sort of an essay towards it in his discoveries, though, as I have before hinted, he was not very cordial in his friendship, I will venture to give it in his words. I remember the players have often mentioned it as an honour to Shakespeare, that in writing whatsoever he penned, he never blotted out a line. My answer hath been, would he had blotted 1,000, which they thought a malevolent speech. I had not told posterity this, for their ignorance, who chose that circumstance to commend their friend by, wherein he most faulted, and to justify mine own candour, for I love the man, and do honour his memory on this side of idolatry as much as any. He was indeed honest, and of an open and free nature, had an excellent fancy, brave notions, and gentle expressions, wherein he flowed with that facility, that sometimes it was necessary he should be stopped. Sophla menandus erat, as Augustus said of Haterius. His wit was in his own power. Would the rule of it had been so too. Many times he fell into those things could not escape laughter, as when he said in the person of Caesar, one speaking to him, Caesar, thou dost me wrong. He replied, Caesar did never wrong, but with just cause, and such like, which were ridiculous. But he redeemed his vices with his virtues. There was ever more in him to be praised than to be pardoned. As for the passage which he mentions out of Shakespeare, there is somewhat like it, Julius Caesar, Volume 5, but without the absurdity. Nor did I ever meet with it in any edition that I have seen as quoted by Mr. Jonson. Besides his plays in this edition, there are 2 or 3 ascribed to him by Mr. Longbane, which I have never seen and know nothing of. He writ likewise Venus and Adonis and Tarquin and Lucrece in stanzas, which have been printed in a late collection of poems as to the character given of him by Ben Jonson. There is a good deal true in it, but I believe it may be as well expressed by what Horace says of the first Romans who wrote tragedy upon the Greek models, or indeed translated him, in his Epistle to Augustus. Natura sublimis a acer nam spirat, tragicum satis and feliciter audet, sed turpem putar in chartis mitic litterum. There is a book of poems published in 1640 under the name of Mr. William Shakespeare, but as I have but very lately seen it, without an opportunity of making any judgment upon it, I won't pretend to determine whether it be his or no.